welcome back to another cult movie review with me, Bo, here on the Film Scene Investigation channel. Thanks so much for checking out the video. In today's review, I'm going to be reviewing the 1986 biopic Sid and Nancy. Before we get into it, guys, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. All the support is greatly appreciated. So, Sid and Nancy from 1986 was written and directed by the British filmmaker Alex Cox and starred Chloe Webb and Gary Oldman in the lead roles. The movie centered around the chaotic life of Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, two key figures in the 70s punk movement. The couple had a very toxic relationship, which led to their premature deaths in the late 70s. While their story is indeed a tragic one, the 1986 movie did somewhat glorify the lives of Sid and Nancy for cinematic purposes. Now, I saw this movie many years ago for the first time when I was a teenager, kind of first getting into music, especially the punk music of the 70s and 80s. I was already a fan of the Sex Pistols, and yeah, I knew who Sid Vicious was, so finding out that there was this movie directed by Alex Cox, yeah, I guess I was kind of intrigued to see a depiction of them on the big screen. So in terms of the narrative, the movie began with the New York authorities at the scene of Nancy Spungen's death. We cut to a very visibly shaken Sid Vicious, who was played by Gary Oldman, sitting on the bed, I guess trying to contemplate what had happened to his girlfriend. Vicious was then taken into custody, where he was interviewed by police. The cops had a strong suspicion that Sid was responsible for Nancy's death, given he was the only other person in the apartment at the time. I know there's been some conspiracy theories over the years about a drug dealer maybe entering and killing Nancy while Sid was asleep. I mean, I don't really kind of go with that theory. All logical reasoning points to the fact that Sid likely had some involvement with Nancy's death. As Vicious was being questioned about how he met Nancy, the film then went back a few years and showed how they met for the first time. Sid had just joined the Sex Pistols, replacing the original bass player Glenn Matlock, and yeah, the band were on the up. They were getting mainstream attention and becoming more and more popular by the day. But the band's increasing popularity didn't seem to bother Sid. Replacing Glenn Matlock, who was a talented musician in his own right, it didn't faze him, kind of trying to fill some big shoes. It was like Sid was just numb to it all, whereas some people may have had some reservations about entering, a fully formed band like the Sex Pistols, who already had their material, written and recorded. He jumped in head first, and yeah, his main priority was just, being in the moment and having a good time. We then saw the trials and tribulations of Sid and Nancy as they became a couple and both developed a very strong addiction for heroin. Sid had indeed dabbled in drugs before. He had injected speed, but he'd never touched anything like heroin before. Nancy, who was already a user of heroin, suggested to Sid that he might want to try some, and so he did, and the rest is history. Everything seemed fine at first when the band, the Sex Pistols, were selling out shows and attracting, a big mainstream audience. But as soon as the band split, the money dried up, the fame dried up, and Sid and Nancy's lives just became worse and worse. The two would eventually move into the Chelsea Hotel in New York City, where Sid attempted to pursue a solo career. But unfortunately for him, he failed in his pursuit of fame and fortune. I mean, nobody really cared about Sid without the Sex Pistols, and given Sid was suddenly so dependent on heroin, the whole thing was just a major car crash. The film culminated with the argument that led to Nancy Spungen death. Rather than shy away from the circumstances, the movie did show how Sid came to stab Nancy in this moment of madness. While the film indeed had a more positive, upbeat tone, the death was a fairly disturbing scene, and I'm really glad it was handled in that way. Now, John Lydon, the lead singer of the Sex Pistols, has gone on record and criticised the movie's ending, which saw Sid and Nancy reunite in this peculiar ending sequence. We had already seen Nancy die. She was dead, yet somehow she came back. She was alive and sitting in this New York taxi cab waiting for Sid to join her. Lydon has dismissed the movie and its ending for its romanticised approach to the story. And, in some ways, I can completely see his point. Sid and Nancy's final months were indeed very ugly and tumultuous, yet this movie took a different direction in order to attract a wider mainstream audience. But, to be fair, in terms of the context to the rest of the film, I thought that the ending worked for what it was, kind of like a dream sequence of sorts. And because the movie was presented through the eyes and perspective of Sid Vicious, the filmmakers were able to take some artistic liberties with the narrative. I think to enjoy Sid and Nancy, moviegoers need to go into this film with the right mindset. People expecting a truthful and honest depiction will no doubt be disappointed. I mean, the whole production was pretty much based around the myth and legend that was Sid Vicious, the gobby punk rocker who nobody could control. I mean, that was a gimmick, that was a persona, and it was all hyped up by the British press. I'm not going to claim I'm some super fan of Sid Vicious and that I know the real Sid, but I'm a fan, and I have seen many of interviews of Sid Vicious. I've read many articles and documentaries, and when it comes to his backstory, I know it pretty well. So looking into Sid's background, it's clear that the punk attitude that Sid had was clearly just smoke and mirrors for his inner turmoil. Sid was neglected as a kid after his dad abandoned him and his mother, Anne. Once the dad left, the mum had, major financial struggles, and from that, Sid was not brought up, but dragged up. And as a teenager, Sid was a lost cause with no prospects. He had no identity and was actively searching for or to be a part of something. And so Sid looked around him, and what did he see? He saw the emerging and thriving punk movement, and he wanted to be a part of that. It was only by mere chance that Sid became a key figure in the history of punk rock. The director Alex Cox could have gone so much deeper with Sid's story, but if anything, this movie was more like a highlight reel. Everything was seen in, rose-tinted glasses, and in that respect, it kind of was a disappointment. And anyone that's ever, done some research on Sid Vicious will know that his mother Anne was an integral part of his life. So if Alex Cox, the director, was aiming for some authenticity, then he absolutely should have cast the mum as a main character in the story. She was a pivotal part of the story of Sid and Nancy, so the fact that we don't get her in this movie kind of sums up what this film is, a very condensed version of events. For many years, I have yearned for a more hyper-realistic biopic on Sid Vicious that included his chaotic childhood and, his final moments before he had his overdose. But yeah, I doubt we'll ever get anything like that. And it's a shame because I think there's a story to tell, and if a competent filmmaker, got their hands on it, I think it could be something really special. And while we're on the subject of Sid Vicious, I might as well just add my views on his death, because, if you ask me, I really do believe that Sid purposely overdosed with the help from his mother. And this all really came down to the fact that Sid just couldn't cope anymore. He didn't have the strength to carry on. While Sid had been held in prison, he had finally got clean from heroin and had not touched drugs for the first time in years. Once Sid got clean, suddenly he became severely depressed, and that was because he finally had a reality check. The realization of what his future looked like finally clicked into place. Nancy had died, and Sid was undoubtedly looking at a lengthy prison sentence, maybe 10 to possibly 20 years. One big detail that I think a lot of people kind of overlook was the fact that when Sid was held on remand in Rikers Island, Sid was sexually assaulted by another prisoner. At that point, Sid had not actually even been charged. He was still on remand awaiting, a court case, and yet he had already got a little taste of what's to come if, he went back to prison. And so knowing that and having that knowledge of, potential further sexual abuse, Sid just wanted out at all costs. Sid's mother, Anne, also knew this. They both, shared a very close bond, and Sid told her everything. And so she knew that really the best option for her son was to die. She didn't want her son to rot away in prison for the next 10 or 20 years. So she helped her son take heroin, take an overdose, and in that way Sid would die young, and the legend of Sid Vicious would live on. Now, when it comes to performances, I thought Gary Oldman was pretty good in the role as Sid Vicious. Oldman definitely didn't look like Sid, nor did he sound like him, but he definitely embodied Sid's style and on-stage persona. Oldman also had some very good chemistry with his co-star Chloe Webb. The two seemed like a genuine couple on screen, which helped with the believability of the story. You know, one thing I've always found interesting about Sid and Nancy was the fact that Courtney Love indeed starred in this movie. Her involvement, yeah, has always really intrigued me. I've always known Courtney Love as the lead singer of Hole, and of course her association with Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. But yeah, I had no idea that she had kind of done some acting before she got into the music industry. You know, when I watched the movie, I didn't see her name in the credits, so yeah, I did a double take when I saw her standing next to Gary Oldman. I was like, Courtney Love? And it is funny to me how the fact that Courtney Love went on to have a more successful music career than both the Sex Pistols and Sid Vicious. Courtney Love, undeniably, back in the heyday, the early 90s, she was a real rock chick who could actually sing and perform live, something that Nancy Spungen could never do. One of the film's main strengths was its brilliant cinematography that was provided by the legendary Roger Deakins. He created some wonderful imagery, and his work definitely raised the film's overall quality. While the shot of Sid and Nancy kissing in the alleyway has become, I guess, the most iconic visual of the movie, I must say I really did like that scene where Sid and Nancy were kind of comatose on the bed and we saw the fire break out in front of them. They were completely zoned out and had no idea about the impending danger that was coming towards them. Yeah, just some great visual imagery there by Deakins as the fire was roaring, and yeah, they just laid there. Music-wise, the legendary musician Joe Strummer provided the song Love Kills, which played at the end credits of the movie. I personally love this track, and yeah, it definitely suited the movie's more kooky and upbeat tone. I'd already heard of Love Kills a few years before actually seeing the movie, so yeah, for me it was just a really awesome Joe Strummer solo track. But yeah, it really worked well with the film, and yeah, the perfect end credit song. Alex Cox, the director, was right to involve Strummer in the film's soundtrack. Strummer was a talented musician in his own right, and his song Love Kills, this catchy new wave 80s track, was the perfect way to close out the film. And so, dislikes for Sid and Nancy from 1986. My biggest dislike for the film would have to be the actress Chloe Webb and her performance as Nancy Spungen. Overall, I thought she was a pretty weak link, and deep down, I don't think she was right for the part. Especially at the start of the film, with Chloe Webb's performance coming off more like a caricature or a poor imitation. Everything she did on screen kind of was dialed up to 11, and it did get somewhat annoying, and it did make me question just how much prep work did Chloe Webb do before she began filming. I say this because we indeed have actual footage of the real Nancy Spungen. We know how she talked, how she walked, her mannerisms, and so that could have been used as a template, but it seemed like Chloe Webb was just, doing her own thing. I think maybe Chloe Webb didn't really truly understand the character of Nancy Spungen, who she was as a person, because at the end of the day, even though Nancy Spungen was indeed wild and she had her moments, she did have a somewhat of a brain. She wasn't completely inept, and with that, this portrayal by Chloe Webb really was pretty lackluster. And so, ratings for Sid and Nancy from 1986. I'm going to be rating this movie a solid 4.5 out of 10. Sid and Nancy was this interesting biopic that delivered an artistic depiction of the 70s punk scene. The movie's main strength, undoubtedly, was the cinematography by Roger Deakins, a stylized interpretation of what happened to Sid and Nancy. I do indeed recommend this movie. I think it's a pretty decent cult film, but I would say that you should take everything with a pinch of salt. If you're after a more truthful version of events, then there are many documentaries out there available on the subject. And well, that's all from me today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed the video. I'll be back next week with another cult movie review. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, take care. I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.